It has been generally agreed by both Britain's friends and foes of the Second World War that British aircraft designer R.J. Mitchell's Vickers Supermarine Spitfire was probably the most remarkable fighter aircraft of its fateful time. Although it was not yet in a large enough supply in the autumn of 1940 to play a leading role in the Battle of Britain, in which the famed Hawker Hurricane still provided most of the fighter aircraft strength of the Royal Air Force, the Spitfire did inflict terrible damage upon the invaders and went on, as its proud breed multiplied to some 20,334 by the end of the war, to become a major instrument in the eventual smashing of the mighty German Luftwaffe. In all, the German invaders lost a total of 1,244 aircraft, the RAF 721. The few, as Winston Churchill so proudly called them, had utterly stunned the enemy with their astonishing display of bold and stubborn defiance. "58-year-old Jerry Billing, a Canadian pilot who now lives in Windsor, Ontario, flew Spitfires as a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force. It was not long after the Battle of Britain, an event that greatly inspired him and increased his determination to become a fighter pilot, that Jerry Billing did become barely old enough to enlist, and after a period of training in Canada, to go overseas, where he realized his great dream of becoming a member of number 19 Squadron of the Royal Air Force. Flight Lieutenant Billing served in Britain and in the rigorous and dangerous defense of Malta, and finally from stations in France. Today, he still flies at air shows and similar events in an impeccably restored Spitfire, belonging to his friend actor Cliff Robertson, who owns 5 other vintage aircraft, as well as one of the 6 airworthy Spitfires still left in all the world. When the Battle of Britain was taking place, Jerry Billing wasn't much older than his teenage son, who now, under the sharp eye of the old Hawk, is himself becoming a fledgling pilot.
Okay. Cockpit cleaned up?
Yep.
How many times you prime it?
I primed her 5 times.
Brakes set.
Brakes are set.
Throttle set.
Throttle set.
Contact.
Contact.
When I was 16 years old, I tried to get into the Royal Air Force. We were on welfare in Canada, and I just wanted to go to the Royal Air Force to join and start flying because I believed I could do that. I really didn't get in as flying first right off. I got in as a gunner. Got into a little bit of trouble in the march before the CO, and I had a sort of a reprimand to dig a sewer out, and the head man in the training happened to see me there, thought I was rather keen, and I asked then to be changed into a potential pilot officer, and he thought, well, you're pretty keen to do this extra work, and he said, do a test and we'll accept you, and that's the way I got into it very quickly. When I left home, I had the coat was real threadbare, especially in the seat. It was an overcoat type. Cardboard in my shoes. And the first station was to stop us out in the west at Winnipeg, and I got off the train about minus 20 centigrade, and I was some cold, I'll tell you. So I very pleased then to get a pair of nice wool socks, brand new shoes, if you can imagine, brand new shoes, and new clothes. And they're paying me now for doing something that I wanted to do. We were well into the Depression, so things were pretty rough. We had 9 children in the family, and so it was quite bad. I knew that I had to leave sometime and leave quickly. Unfortunately, the war started. To me, it was a godsend on it. Another thing I remember clearly is they'd have Christmas time. They'd give you a tub full of food as a Christmas gift. In that tub were socks, and my sisters would get these long socks, only they were bright red. And the only people that wore these socks were people on welfare, and the girls were very hesitant to wear these bloody socks. It was a telltale deal, eh? Yeah. They'd rather freeze and have red legs than red socks.
The Royal Air Force base at Hawkins, near Dover, was a cheering sight to those fighter pilots and bomber crews who sometimes had to come limping back across the English Channel in damaged planes or those with fuel tanks dangerously close to the empty mark. It was one of the first havens to be sighted on the way back home and was an extremely welcome one. Now its mess hall and other buildings are being refurbished for use as a youth camp. It may seem terribly empty now, but it is still full of memories for the like of Jerry Billing.
The best time I had was with the Czechs and Poles, like on that 19 Squadron. They would want to go day and night. I could go where I wanted. They'd give me an aircraft to pit against anybody with guns, a license to go ahead and go where I wanted. And I'm sitting over top of Dieppe, and then D-Day. I was sitting completely watching D-Day from a grandstand seat that a millionaire couldn't buy. And this was, to me, was a real great thing. And D-Day was a very quiet day, as far as we were concerned in the air. It was the day after D-Day we got into the Germans. In the Middle East, again in Malta, you sat for hours, and sometimes maybe minutes before you were scrambled. In the flight in England, you sat at the readiness at the dispersal out in the sun or something, and the telephone would ring, and you'd hear the telephone ring, and for years later, whenever a phone rang, you thought maybe there was something going. But out in the Middle East, or on some squadrons, you would sit by your squadron, your aircraft, or in your aircraft. And if the red flares went up, double red, it was a scramble. You simply took off, punched in your channel for your frequency and your operations control for your direction and your altitude. It was the 1st of July when I was shot down, and I was so thirsty. Remember, the steak was all cooked and everything, and Hap Kennedy and I came up, and we got our steak in the plate. Just sat down, and a dispatch writer came up, and he says, "Scramble in green section." Holy jeez. And that's so Hap says, "Come on, Jerry, let's go." So we were low level. The weather was kind of bad. We're patrolling back and forth, 3 of us. And I was on the inside towards the lines, and we kept turning a bit. And each time we'd turn, we weren't seeing anything, and the patrol or the bogey that was coming in had turned around and disappeared. So they told us to continue patrolling. Twice we did it over top of this large wooded area. Jeez. So we turned around. I know as soon as I got straightened out, and all hell broke loose. Holes in the wings, and the engine was smoking. It was a direct hit on me. So at that point, I hollered, and I said, "Hap, I've been hit." I couldn't see out. It was covered with smoke and oil all over everything, and it was flame and stuff. And so all I did was turn to the left, jettison my hood, and then saw this area in the woods that now I'm aiming for to land short of in the marshy area. I saw a bunch of soldiers ahead. So as I was crashing or coming in, I just simply froze my thumb on the button of the cannon machine gun and forgot about that, then worried about hitting. And I hit about 260 miles an hour because the space was running out, and I just jammed the nose down onto the ground. It hopped over a small road, and then the port cannon dug in and swung me around. And when everything sort of stopped, the dust or whatever, the guns were still going in this damn thing. I still had the button down. And then I sort of relaxed. I look around for the angels, but then I realized my mistake. They now start shooting back at me.
When Jerry Billing was shot out of the sky, he chose to ride his Spitfire down to a crash landing on a farm field in Normandy. And in the uproar that accompanied his landing, he managed to make a successful dash to concealment in the waters of a nearby swamp. And there, among the rushes and the underbrush, he most uncomfortably lay in hiding for 3 whole days. When at last he considered it safe to emerge, water-soaked, from his wet and chilly hiding place, he began walking southward through the German-occupied territory, sometimes right past enemy troops, who seemed quite disinterested in such a scruffy-looking wayfarer. His closest call during this trek was when he did get stopped on one occasion by a German soldier who was holding him at the time at gunpoint. When the soldier took his eyes off him for a moment to peer in the direction of some sudden commotion around a nearby corner, Jerry Billing knifed him and fled. He spent one night during this dangerous journey inside a pile of brush so close to some German troops that he could hear them talking. It had not been long after Jerry Billing's arrival in Briolle that most of the villagers were well aware of his presence. Yet, during his 5-week stay amongst them, not one of them ever revealed it to the Germans who were still occupying their town. They weren't members of any underground organization, but simply ordinary villagers and farmers who were determined to protect their ally, even though the penalty for doing so might be death. Jerry Billing was even taken into the family of a one-armed First World War veteran named Pascal de Bourgeois, who covered up Jerry's inability to speak French, sometimes in the actual presence of the Germans, by explaining that he was a nephew who had become a deaf mute after a bombing raid on St. Lo. Pascal de Bourgeois, along with many of Jerry Billing's other old friends of 1944, now lies buried in the small cemetery at Briolle, some having died of natural causes, others as victims of the war and the occupation. Thanks to Pascal and his staunch neighbors, Jerry Billing was able to safely remain in their midst until the advance of the American troops after D-Day reached the village and allowed him, at last, to come out into the open and display his identity card, a document that might have meant death had it ever been discovered by the enemy. On his most recent visit to France, Jerry Billing found even some of the parts of his Spitfire on a farm near where he had been shot down.
As they say, some 40 years old, those pieces. And that's rubber and it hasn't deteriorated. Not one bit. That's from the coolant system off the aircraft.
Indeed, one of its wheels was still doing service, having over the years been sadly demoted from being an important part of the landing gear of a 365 miles an hour Spitfire to the lowly role as part of a 2 miles per hour homemade French wheelbarrow. The puncture-proof tire still contained its original air, in spite of the fact that Jerry was able to still pick out of its surface no less than 19 fragments of the enemy's flak.
Serviceable and attached it to the hayrick. In 1974, I was here and Daniel gave me the port wheel, which I have at home, and I also extracted flak pieces, which I have now in plastic at home. And the wheel I have organized as a coffee table in the main room at home. It has, I made a shaft from it with a mahogany type thing, John, and at the top.
Old bits and pieces on an old Normandy farm, a place that once provided a precious haven of safety in a now old war. Yet, for Jerry Billing, the memories were still remarkably fresh, clear, and still very much together. is hard to believe that the wide blue skies of summer were once so cruelly filled with peril. Had this land not been so gallantly and stubbornly defended in those lofty air battles which once laced these now tranquil skies with 1,000 contrails of aircraft in deadly combat, Adolf Hitler's swastika flag might now be flying there. The urgent warning, "Achtung, Spitfires," when flashed over the radios of the Luftwaffe invaders as a swiftly flying RAF flight approached, carried a certain extra sharp note of anxiety, even when spoken by very brave men. One of the bravest of them all among these former enemies, Adolf Galland, a top-ranking ace of the Luftwaffe, a general while still in his 20s, wearer of the highest order of the coveted Iron Cross, was once asked by a desperate and enraged Reich Marshal Hermann Göring what he required to help bolster the sagging fortunes of the Luftwaffe, to which General Galland boldly replied, "A few squadrons of Spitfires."